and welcome to What Now, an interview series brought to you by Michigan Future Inc. that asks, what are we learning today during the coronavirus pandemic that will help us build prosperity for Michigan families tomorrow? I'm your host, Sarah Sherpicki, a Vice President at Michigan Future. One area where many Michigan families are gaining some new perspectives this year is in education. A system that's been highly disrupted by the pandemic, it's maybe more appreciated than ever. Yet it's also a good time to ask, is this what education should look like? Do we all agree on what education should do? When the pandemic ends, most schools will look the way schools looked 50 years ago. Is that appropriate given the rapid changes in our economy, job market, and communities? Today, my guests are two education leaders who are striving to ask those questions for the students they serve and to explore what's next for education. Lisa Bergman is the Executive Director of Renaissance Public School Academy in Mount Pleasant. She brings almost 30 years of experience in education, first as a K-8 teacher, then principal, and then in other administrative roles. Lisa Diaz is the Executive Director and founder of the Lumen Impact Group, a consulting firm that helps organizations grow, think, and act strategically. But before Lumen, she ran the Michigan Association of Public School Academies for over a decade. And she's now a highly engaged board member and thought partner to Lisa Bergman at Renaissance. Welcome, Lisa and Lisa.
Thanks for having us.
Before the pandemic, you and your team worked on developing something you were calling your defining practices that really articulated like what was special about Renaissance. So could you walk us through those a little bit?
So we were good with our elevator speech, right? We were a project-based learning school. We were multi-age. We wanted to be individualized. We wanted these connections with families and wanted the experience of learning for young children for them to have a voice in that journey. And it really was in the very beginning stages of this development of what has come to be known through all of this. We are calling our 4 defining practices. Mm-hmm. So we looked at all of the work that we had done, all of the learning that as adults and staff members and what we were striving for with children. And we really narrowed them down to these 4 ideas that when we saw them together resonated. It was really one of those light bulb moments, mm-hmm. It felt like. Mm-hmm. And those are connections with students. That is the fundamental beginning to all the work that we do. Mm-hmm. And then with those connections comes the idea of honoring and digging deep into student voice and their choice in their learning and the potential that has even when you're 5, 7, 8 years old. Mm-hmm. We also came to realize through some deep conversations that project-based learning comes with a lot of preconceived ideas and notions. And as we worked through the best practices in that, we realized that we were striving towards really inquiry-based approaches. Mm-hmm. So we, on the outside, continue to use the term project-based learning because it is something that makes people comfortable and they feel they understand. But that third defining practice for us that we are working to weave through everything is inquiry. And then the 4th is a truly deep commitment to professional learning. And as an adult community, our belief that the strength of our school and the strength of the learning environment really comes from the strength of the adults, and that we steer all of that. So for 1, 2, and 3, connections, voice and choice, and inquiry to happen, we, as a learning community of staff members developing and growing our school, we have to be really committed to deep professional learning, mm-hmm. And that it's ongoing. Mm-hmm. I think we often say we have to accept that there really is no endpoint in this journey. So if you're waiting to sort of arrive or get there, mm-hmm. That just is not part of what we believe is possible. That mm-hmm. once you get good at something, you're going to continue to grow in other ways.
Mm-hmm. Lisa Diaz, I want to sort of bring you in on the question of the defining practices as well. And as a board member, what was your sort of engagement around that, and how are you watching that start to live at the school?
Actually, I think we look at it from many different angles. So we look at it from the student's perspective first, because I mean, the conversations we usually have is putting students first. So as we make decisions, as we think about it, so we look at that picture of what that looks like, but we also look at it in regards to staff. So what will staff be experiencing? How will they be talking? What will we start seeing in that evolution?
Mhm.
And then also the families. You know, we believe those three components really need to be in our future state vision of all in each of these four elements we're talking about, because each of them play a role in getting us there.
For people who have not, for people who aren't like deep in education, I think it would be great if we could give them some examples of what you think high quality project-based learning is. And I mean really tangible, like here's a project that a sixth grader might do.
So I mentioned earlier that idea that a lot of people believe they know what project-based learning is, right? So in their mind, everyone brings in this beautiful shoebox diorama and we set them up around the room and put them in a showcase. And maybe there's a nice little report next to it and you can walk around and read it. There's elements of that. We've had learning celebrations where things looked very much alike. The key pieces for us as we've moved forward are these more collaborative events where the students and the learning is driven by the students. So this beginning with the end in mind, asking students this really large driving question, and then again, as the staff member, how do you guide those conversations? Mm-hmm. So putting in front of students saying, these are all the things that when we're done, we have to know that you know how to do and such. So as you move from a diorama and a shoebox to, I think one of the most powerful examples was that 2 years ago, our 5th and 6th grade students put on the only United Nations sanctioned World Water Day events in the state of Michigan, which when you think about it, our fresh water, that's who we say we are. And the United Nations has a designated World Water Day, and our 5th and 6th graders are pulling it off at a venue with keynote speakers and booths. And so also then integrated in that was community members coming in and our students doing booths as well. So they're demonstrating their learning. And in all of that comes this really authentic audience. So it's one thing to talk to your teacher and say, here's my shoebox and all the elements are there. It's another to have really strangers, college students we held it and at the casino here in town in a large ballroom. So people from anywhere, kids were calling them in and giving to talk to someone and say, this is what I know about microplastics in the Great Lakes. And I'm 11, alongside, someone from the DEQ who's also, giving out their pamphlets on, water preservation and such. So in that stays with a student. That those 5th and 6th graders will go their entire lives and say, I understand the basic tenets of the importance of fresh water in our state and in the world. They may not have every element of every science standard memorized that goes along with it. And where does that happen? But they know the importance and they know where to go and get accurate information. And that's the difference. That's that example of this really holistic look at learning and understanding what to do with information instead of memorize it, take a test on it, and about 30%, you'll remember in a couple of weeks.
And Lisa, I'd add to that, it's not just about what they learned about fresh water. It's also some of what I would call soft skills. I mean, they wrote letters, they talked to different individuals to ask them to participate or to help them in their learning. And this isn't just in this project. You're seeing this with many projects that students are doing, is kind of pushing them a little outside of their safe and comfort zone and exposing them to, professionals in the field that can add and grow and the skills they're learning to write an email and to make a phone call and to do an interview. I mean, those are skills and not to mention the skills they're learning, because they do a lot of this collaboratively, right? All three of my boys have attended Renaissance and been through Renaissance, and I have one still there. And the skills they learn in regards to collaboration and presentation and the confidence that comes from that, that will serve them way beyond if they go into nothing that has to do with water. Right? Serve them forever in their life and in their pursuits.
You know, at Michigan Future, the sort of framework that we support it for thinking about kids learning in the 21st century are the 6 C's. So communication, collaboration, content is in there. They need to know some stuff. Critical thinking, creative innovation, and confidence. And so as both of you are talking about this project, I'm thinking about the sense of confidence that kids in which they can grow when they're having to do something real, you know, with other real adults who come and sort of validate their learning and not just the teachers. So it's like real to them. So yeah, Lisa Diaz, could you talk a little bit also about how you see the importance of skills like that as a board maybe, or just as a school, like those skills and in the future these kids are entering?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the hardest part, and I've seen this with board members we've had in the past, is how we learned, right? Which was a lot of memorization and regurgitation, right? I mean, I still have nightmares of those drill and kill times tables experiences, right? I mean, and I still see some value in some of that, but there is many things. We didn't have Google, right? I mean, we didn't know, there wasn't existence. So, I mean, we as adults now are looking at and trying to understand education in a way that is not how we experience education. The issue of memorizing, our kids are like, we don't need to memorize anything, we just Google it, right? So I think from our perspective that the content is important because they got to even know that it exists, that there's even content out there, right? That there's study on this, there's research on this. We need you to understand that. We need you to also understand how to even think through the process of what is the question I need to ask, right? What's the information I need to go grab? Because there's so much information now. If you don't know how to even begin to, you know, qualify that parameter of what you're going to look for, it's going to be very challenging.
That's right. Yeah.
But on the other side of it, looking at it, and we have a number of business folks on our board, we talk about some of those great employees, you know, those people that are really, they might not know the product. They may not know the exact element of this product we're trying to work with. But if they have all those other skills and they're coachable, and that's a big piece, right? Because that's one thing they're doing at Renaissance. They're giving these kids feedback. They're giving peer feedback. They're giving leader feedback. They're giving outsiders feedback, and they're open to it. They're asking questions around, give me some feedback, right? If they can be coachable, you can learn the skill in most cases, right? If you have all those other components to bring to it. So again, not that we discredit and say that the root of the content isn't important. I mean, we still have value putting on looking at our assessments and things like that. But I would tell you that is not our top priority. Like, we don't sit around and just debate NWEA scores and what we're going to do. That is one indicator of a lot of different indicators that we look at of what success is for our students.
Well, and part of how I think about the importance of content is that you can't actually do some of the higher order things without having some basic content. So you can't do critical thinking if you don't know enough about the thing you're trying to think critically about. It is not as important. So it's sort of something that everything else needs to be built around, but it's maybe less important what that particular content is.
Well, and I think that's what Renaissance is really is doing better and continuing to improve on, is we'll give you a base, and then we're going to give you a voice to figure out what area do you have the most interest in, and do you want to go deeper in? Because that then helps continue to have students have ownership of their learning, right? I'm sure we've all had, you know, times where we're having to go deeper in something we're not that engaged in, and it is painful, right? But what if we found ways that they can go deep in those things that they're really engaged with, and that just spurs their interest in school? It makes the other side of it, when you're working on some things that are a little tougher, it makes it a little easier because all your energy isn't drained, from all the things that maybe didn't grab your attention.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, another really concrete example would be what our 3rd and 4th graders, who are our Islanders, participate in what we call Wonder Workshop. And so at least there's this interesting balance, especially with elementary age students, of you do need to understand the difference between letters and numbers and how to read, right? To grasp the content, you have to read eventually. And so how does all of that happen in the course of the right now, the number of days and hours and all of those traditional structures that are there, and then still have that voice and choice? Mm-hmm. So the Wonder Workshop setup says to students, you choose your topic, and then the end product is that you present to your peers. So about once a month or every 6 weeks, they have exactly 20 minutes for an introduction, a presentation, and a Q&A. So they have to decide how much time they use. So they can have up to 20 minutes. And they put on almost like a conference style piece where you see at 9 o'clock, these 4 students are presenting. You choose who you go to listen to. And so in that way, and then they ask questions and give feedback. So we've taught, they learn sort of these feedback stems, like I was wondering, or next time you may want to consider, or did you ever think about that, like really open-ended pieces. And then, so instead of, again, hearing it from a parent or a teacher, they're hearing it from a peer, number one. And number two, it's exposing 100 of these Islander students to 99 other topics, potentially. Everything from how do you put a saddle on a horse to how do drones work and can you build your own drone, to 3D, to puppies, right? So some students, that's where their interest is. And it leads to those next coaching conversations with teachers to say, all right, you've done puppies. What do you want to do next? That's on display in the building. But that other need to expose young children to everything there is in the world can't come just from the teacher reading books and showing little video clips. The power comes from when your classmate stands in front of you and talks about something you knew nothing about, and how graphic novels are made or how a book is put together. Again, that it makes that breadth of information, that exposure that's so important for young children, without having it all be in the hands of the teacher, in a sense.
And Lisa, I think too, it also creates this environment of inclusiveness, right? That they become so accepting and understanding of. My kid doesn't live on a farm, but he's heard plenty of presentations about farm life and what it's like and what they do, and the appreciation that can grow from that, and the understanding that we're different, but we can be inclusive with each other. That's one thing I've always said about Renaissance. It is so accepting of all different types and interests. And I think Wonder Workshop and other projects that they do help just bond that even tighter for kids.
We lead off Wonder Workshop every year with their first presentation is something that they're already an expert on. So it's, if a different language is spoken in their home, they may do that. If there's something special that is cooked in their home, or a sport that they are good at, or the collection, right? How often do we say no card collecting or game exchange at school? But when you say, all right, you can talk about your Pokemon cards and get it out of your system. And if you come from a home that doesn't have any of that, you at least then understand, well, that's what Pokemon is all about, or whatever the 7-year-old craze is, that sometimes as a school we say, no, not at school. Don't bring those things. Let him bring it or her bring it. Let them do their presentation. And then we move on.
So let us shift to the challenging opportunity, the year that we're in right now, and how you guys have shifted during the pandemic and try to adapt some of the practices and priorities that you have to this new sort of learning environment that we're in this year. Lisa Bergman, why don't you start?
A year ago, I think it was the Thursday of the governor's announcement, I was meeting with a parent and I said, no way, right? And our lives in 24 hours changed in so many ways. And I think it's human nature to look at, to long for things that you knew. And now a year later, this idea of what really this opportunity to say what was truly important, what needs to stay with us, what do we value in the work we're doing, and where do we see ourselves going? Because the conversation for a very long time, for much of this year, has been, what are we going to do? How will we fix it? How will we survive? Versus who do we want to be as we move forward? Last year, we stayed virtual the entire time. We focused, our number one piece was at defining practice number one, right? Connections with every one of our families. We had some systems in place that, in that trust and that face-to-face we had for so long, paid huge dividends for us in the end. This year, giving families the opportunity to choose between a face-to-face option that we have offered since August, or what we called a distance learning option, because virtual felt like it wasn't personal enough for us. We chose to, we made commitments to attempting to give students as much of a similar experience and similar exposure and content, both in-house and distanced from one another, or just in the distance learning setting. So in those ways, we stayed true to our commitments to collaboration time for our teams. So we didn't change any of that. We just said, how do we stay connected to families? We stayed true to our student-led conferences. It was messy. I mean, that kind of a transition to feedback, gradeless progress reports, and student-led conferences all happened last year. And we said, we're not going back. We will figure out how those will happen. We had 96% of our students participate in their own student-led conference this fall, all virtually. But it just led to times when the whole family is around the kitchen table while the student's presenting, the teacher's on the video call, and they're having conversation, and the student has their whole family there, right? Their bubble was there to see their student-led conference in those pieces.
Well, I don't want to interrupt you, but could you talk a little bit about this move to student-led conferences and sort of what the thinking is behind them? Because it's so interesting.
So that comes along with that defining practice of student voice and choice. We spent several years wrestling with our own thoughts about, what do grades mean? What does a B+ tell a 9-year-old? What does 77% of learning mean? All of those pieces that we just knew, or we believed that when you left us as an end of 8th grade, you had to have to survive at high school. I have not met a high schooler that has come back yet and said, man, Mrs. Bergman, if I had only understood what a B+ or a 3.2 meant, it would have made all the difference. So that process involved adult understanding, adult belief changes, shifting of your own mindset. That takes time. So from there, the feedback piece, the narrative feedback that our students receive, and the same pacing that goes to their families as we would have done a report card, in a sense. Around those same times, we say to families, here is the narrative about what we know about your students' growth, your child's growth, their potential, those pieces. And instead of you coming in and us going through that again, adult to adult, we would like to invite you to a conversation that your child will lead. And so the student leads that conversation, including kindergartners and our Voyagers, our 1st and 2nd graders. They plan and prepare a presentation of their strengths, of their grows and glows, whether or not they have achieved their goals, what their goals are moving forward. And this need that adults had well, where will the adult conversation happen? It just, will we do 2 sets of conferences? Will the student do a conference? And then will the parent want another conference? Has not been the case at all. Some are shorter.
Lisa Diaz, I want to add your voice to this conversation about like what is helpful for students to be learning about their learning as they grow. Like what was your thinking around grades and the point of grades and what feedback could be more meaningful for families and students?
Yeah, I do think the grade transition was challenging for adults at first, right? Because again, how we grew up and what we saw, it was challenging to be like, well, what does this mean? And I think that it took some time, and Lisa and the team did a lot of education. Actually, I remember the parent teacher conferences because we made the grade change before we made the student-led conference change. So I remember conferences, we just spent time talking about what this grading system was now like, right? And so I know that was a transition, but once we made that transition, I think what we've seen now, and I'm speaking both as a board member, as a parent, because again, being fortunate that I have that parent role in this too, helps me see it from another angle, is I think what we're seeing is more ownership being put on that student for their education. So before, we'd have a parent-teacher conference without the student, and then the parent would go home and now try to work on accountability with their student, right? Now, what we're doing is trying to create self-accountability with that student themselves, with an accountability partner, not just being the teacher, right? The parent is there too, but the ownership is not on the parent to drive the change, and the ownership isn't on the teacher to drive the change. The ownership is really on that student. And I think that's what we've seen is like, when you have students set goals, talk about, did they hit it? What are their grows and glows? Like they really, as Lisa said, there's some pride in there. And again, their goal is they want to come and also be proud of themselves, not just to be impressing you as a parent or a teacher. So, I mean, I think that is starting to change that mindset.
It's really shifting the burden of responsibility, right? So that A or B plus or whatever is this totally external assessment. You can even divorce it. It's not yours. The teacher gave it to you, as opposed to having to say, I've got to stand behind my work in some way. Got to be able to talk about it,
And the blame can't happen, right? So you have to hear, well, the teacher didn't teach it well. They didn't, and we kind of shift that, right? And I've seen my kids, be able to shift it. It's no, it's not the teacher here. I mean, you might not have understood the lesson, but it's your job to own getting what you need in order to, achieve what you're trying to achieve here. And that is a shift in ownership that kids are, and it's challenging at times. They're not all getting it perfect, right? But I think that the tenets is there to try to push more students in that direction.
So I want to ask you guys, as you're thinking about one day the pandemic will be over, what do you want to prioritize? Like, what do you want to be different? No, let me ask this. What are you going to be most prioritizing for your students when school is like normal again in response to the pandemic? Lisa Diaz.
So I don't know if I can answer that specific, question. The question that I've asked Lisa and the team is what I think all schools will be making a mistake is as normality returns potentially, if we go back to exactly the way were before, right? I think there's some danger to that, right? I think there's some danger of all of a sudden we're back in our classroom with the kids and we're going to go back to the routine of everything we did before because it's safe, it's comfortable, it's kind of what we've known, and we can breathe deep and say we know this, right? I think that's a mistake. I think that there's some unbelievable things that have happened out of necessity. We didn't have a choice, right? That we can take. And have we perfected it? No, I don't think we've perfected it in the midst of all this. But have we built a great base that we can perfect and work and get better? Yes. And so that's the question I keep asking, or I've challenged Lisa and her team to say, what are we gonna keep doing? Like, what are we gonna, we've learned from this, we're gonna keep doing it. What are the things we're gonna add back in? We had to stop it because of, we couldn't cross classrooms, we couldn't, what are we gonna add back in, but we're gonna intentionally add it back in because it was important and it helped us move us forward. And what are we gonna stop doing and not go back to? Because if we let it sneak back in, it's comfortable. And it's going to be really, then we're going to have to go through a whole change process to change it again. So we don't have to go through that change process. That happened for us. The pandemic happened, forced change. So how do we not fall ourselves back into old patterns?
System-wide, in education, the pull right now is not just to go back to where we were last March, but almost like to take this step back to where we were 10 years ago to 25 years ago, to these really measurable pieces. Like, there are 26 letters in the alphabet. So how many letters does the child know? And that's what defines them. And not a fear, but a piece that we are not, a place that we are not going to go toward here at Renaissance is that idea that if we can measure it really explicitly, that is what's going to get the most attention, and that's where we stay because it's safe. And so our current conversations are, what are we doing well right now? What did we know how to do that we need to remember and keep in the forefront? But really looking again ahead. Those defining practices, they were a source, they are a source, they really were a source of inspiration and excitement and joy for all of us, not just the learners, but staff and for families. Keeping that alive is key. I believe there's going to be a huge pull from a lot of different directions to go back to what you can measure with a really concrete number. And so knowing that, acknowledging it, talking, like Lisa said, yes, these places are safe, but are they best? And do they align with what we believe in the potential of our students? I would love to see more people enter into the conversation and take a little bit of, there's no better time to take a risk, to have some really crazy conversations, and they're not even that crazy. I mean, the research behind the work we're doing, we're not inventing anything new, Sarah. This has been here. This work has been done and has been proven to be successful for students moving forward, especially for what the future holds. It is not, you have to be comfortable with sometimes being uncomfortable and letting students, and not being the person who is ultimately in charge of every move that children make. Trust them some.
And I think as a board, on that note, on a board perspective, you have to do the same. We've been driven so much as boards to, NWEA rules or the state assessment rules, and your success is so aligned to that. When we started this adventure with Lisa, 8 years ago, Lisa? Is that how long it's been?
Almost 9 now.
Almost 9. I mean, we were a traditional we were a traditional school. I wouldn't say we were that much different than our traditional district school. We were an option. And when we looked at this, we said, we don't want to just be an option. We want to be a sought after. We want people to choose this because it is different than what they will get at the other school in our community, other schools. And when we did that as a board, we knew that it was going to take us turning this thing upside down, shaking it out, and turning it back. And in that whole time, we said, we are not going to put our worth just in test scores. We're going to look at other things. And we knew we may see a decline. And even now, we can see some ups and downs, and not that they don't matter, but we as a board do not put the value of our school in that. And we still don't discredit it either, because we can have great grounded kids that can't read, and we've not set them up for success, right? Yeah. So we have to have both, but you can't let the pendulum swing all the way one way. That's how you're going to be, because what happens when that happens is you start driving back to let's teach the test. Let's go back to memorization. Let's go. And we don't want, that's not what we believe is going to get our kids long-term success.
So I think that one of the things one of the things we hear a lot when we talk about testing as an organization with other folks is sort of like, well, can't you have both in the current system? Nothing says you can't do both. And so I was wondering if you guys could talk about, I mean, you are navigating a way to find both, but from talking to other educators, I do understand the sort of pressure that there is to focus exclusively on the tests. Can you talk about how that pressure is real? You know, like, or how does it operate on you? Because I think some people just don't believe that everybody should just be able to ignore it, kind of, or, you know, that. So maybe Lisa Diaz, do you want to start? But I want to hear from both of you on that.
Yeah, so this is an interesting story. One time remember, we're a charter school, so we get authorized, or we can not have our contract renewed. Mm-hmm. We had a conversation once that the authorizer and sometimes sees themselves as the regulator, right? Mm-hmm. And regulators are looking for black and white things to measure. And there was a conversation once that said, well, we would take test scores over looking at culture. We think culture is important, but the culture is not as important as the test scores. Mm-hmm. And my argument is you can never get anywhere if you don't have the culture. I mean, good luck implementing anything. Mm-hmm. And so I do believe there is still this pressure because in our case, it's like, do you know us well enough to know us more than a test score? And what they've pushed us to do at times is say, well, come up with what are those other indicators that are going to show success. And I'm going to tell you, it's a very challenging thing because we can come up with them. We talk about them. We look at some different things, but are they regulator, black and white feeling indicators? That's the challenge, right? And that is, I think, the push then gets pushed back on test scores. And so as a board, we have to really be conscious to not get quickly drawn back in there and push our team to go in that direction because it's tempting at times, right? At the same time, again, our goal is to make sure all our kids can go and function at the academic level they need to be at. So we don't ignore it, but it's not our sole driver.
But teachers feel it. Sarah, I think that's a really important piece. Even in a school that I would say our culture was strong, we are surviving this well. And there's still that pull for them every day. If they turn on the news, read the paper, engage with even their professional organizations to careful, that test is coming back and that test is who you are. And so being a different voice in that or reminding that is a really important part of leadership, I think, right now. And if as a leader, imagine I'm in a role where my board is saying, well, Lisa, those test scores are key. That's how we will measure you. It all comes, right? It all starts at the top.
So before we wrap up, I just want to ask, are there other things in the system that make what you're trying to accomplish difficult? Or make the approaches that you're trying to take difficult? And Lisa Bergman, I'll start with you, but I want to ask you too, Lisa Diaz.
Our tendency, as a state, very much as a state, and even as a country, to really still judge by small measures. That idea that has accountability done what we wanted it to do, other than maybe drive people out of a really worthwhile profession? Those kind of pieces are in place. I have concerns about some of the ways we've handled. I love flexibility, but I'm also a rule follower. I have some concerns about those who may have taken advantage of the flexibility and down the road will result in tighter regulations. I don't have a good answer to how you measure trust other than being in schools and understanding what a school is, in those pieces. So the social emotional pieces and the time that we will need to give to kids to get back the academic pieces, we know how to do that. We will fill these gaps. These children are not going to go into adulthood with large gaping holes in what they know. The academic piece is the easy side of this. I really believe moving forward, it is whether or not we put all our eggs in that basket and ignore the whole child in the process. And I would love to be able to keep hold of some of the flexibility, but we'll see where that heads.
I would ditto most of what Lisa said. And the only thing I would add to it is I think the biggest challenge is being treated just like we don't want to treat kids, right? As a whole, not as an individual. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges for Renaissance is, are we grouped in the whole, right? And then regulated in the whole, and then, constraint because of, as Lisa said, some players didn't, took advantage or did something, not in what we would consider like that, the sphere of excellence. And I think that's a danger. I think that will just take the creativeness, the innovative parts, the risk-taking ability, all out of this model and push us back to a very traditional model of school that I truly do not believe works for all children. I mean, I think there's some kids that thrive in it, but I just think there is this need to have more options for kids that are different. And I'm a little afraid that the fear and the learning loss that we're going to look at after this last year and a half, that's going to push tighter constraints and limitations that could really affect the school in the long run.
Are there any other questions that you think as a community we should really be wrestling with in terms of how to take this weird pause or on education and make the whole system healthier?
I think continued conversations. I mean, one other piece, another positive that has come out of this is how we've learned to connect across places. Now, I did say to my husband the other day, I really want to get on an airplane and go somewhere. And what I wouldn't give to drive back down, to the Metro Detroit area for a meeting and listen to an audiobook and all that time we spent, right? But we used it well. These facilitating conversations and finding as many avenues and platforms to do that is important. And part of me wants to force some conversation, make people come in, at least be listeners, at least come into the conversation and leave thinking that we're a little crazy, but at least you heard it. And so one thing schools, especially it seems in Michigan, I mean, we're wound tight. We like our test scores because they can measure us, and we don't talk to each other. And the power of doing that, especially, Sarah, in and across rural areas, I think that this platform, and the more we can get into conversations with one another and make time for it, is the only way to make, and we just, I realized, didn't talk to each other enough before because we always thought we had to be in the room. Now, granted, I want to get back in the room. Don't get me wrong. I love my room.
Well, thank you both so much for giving me this time and talking with us today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
In our next episode, we'll be talking with Ira Sokol and Pam Moran, co-authors of Timeless Learning: How Imagination, Observation, and Zero-Based Thinking Change Schools. Please join us.
Kids gain that knowledge because they need it at the moment to do the authentic things they want to do, instead of the decontextualized education that we try to force down kids' throats.
We'd love to hear from you about how to make Michigan's education system work better for all kids. Please find us on social media.